back to Seville Community Church of God and our third week in Revelation. Just a recap of where we've gone so far, what we've covered so far. You guys have your note packets. I also have outlines. So if you weren't here and you would like an outline, before I forget, let me get those out. An outline of Revelation. Lisa, you want to see if anybody needs any of these? Just tells us, gives us a rough structure and skeleton of the entire book of Revelation, and that's going to help us in our study as we seek to move around Revelation and use the Bible to interpret the Bible. That's the best tool we can possibly use to do that. But so far, we've covered the first part of Revelation, but before that, we set up what we're studying. We talked about the author, the historical context, the theological themes that are found in Revelation. We went over a bunch of that nerdy stuff. And then last week we got down to business, covered the structure and content, and got into Revelation. Just a reminder of the structure, and we'll try to break it up and keep these headings in the back of our mind as we go through our study. The introduction, Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Then the next section we'll call the vision of Christ, starting at verse 9 in chapter 1 and going through chapter 3, verse 22. Then the vision, another vision about the coming events, chapter 4 through 16. And then starting in chapter 17, the vision describing the punishment of the great prostitute. And then in Revelation 21, till the end is the vision of the bride. So 4 distinct visions with a whole lot of stuff going on in each vision. And we're going to slow down and go through and make sure we first understand the text. We really want to understand what the text is trying to convey and then go from there. We've covered Revelation chapter 1, verses 1 through 8. Very good introduction. Now we're going to turn our Bibles and start at verse 9. I'll share a little bit. We'll exegete the text. We'll talk about it, and we'll get fairly far. We'll get through the rest of the introduction, or at least chapter 1, and then we'll have discussion at the end. So starting at verse 9, says this: I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom and the patient endurance that are in Jesus, was on the island called Patmos on account of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet saying, write what you see in a book and send it to the 7 churches, to Ephesus, to Samaria, to Pergamum, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. So verses 9 through 11, we'll kind of chunk that up and talk about the important things that I found in the study. Right at the beginning it says, I, John. We talked about this John as the Apostle John. And we came to a pretty good consensus that is in fact who was writing this Revelation. And it's a little bit redundant from the beginning, right in the beginning, starting at verse 1 in Revelation. But John identifies himself as being a partner in the tribulation, the kingdom, and the endurance and the perseverance. This is a little bit lost on us, but when you read it in the Greek, there's the article, and then these 3 things should be taken together. So he is a partner. This John the Apostle John, is a partner in the tribulation. Notice that present tense, it's now. And the kingdom, again, now. And the patient endurance that are in Jesus, all in Jesus, all 3 of these things. And also, too, the sounding of this structure so far sounds a lot like Daniel chapter 7. I shared that Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 10. Man, John right now is sounding an awful lot like the prophet Daniel, and some of the visions he has, we'll study, sound very much the same as the visions, or very similar to the visions that Daniel had. back in the book of Daniel. But here he is, the partner of the kingdom and the endurance and the tribulation that is current and seems to be continuing. The Lord's Day, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day, general consensus, actually, it's Sunday. At the Lord's Day. By this time, whether you take an early view of when Revelation was written or a late view, during this time it was pretty established that the church would meet on the Lord's Day or Sunday, the Resurrection Sunday. And that's pretty much the widely held view that that's what John is talking about. So I was in the Spirit on Sunday. That's not necessarily the Holy Spirit. John was not in a trance, as it were, but John was in a spiritual state. He was in a spiritual realm, not an earthly realm, but a spiritual realm. So we don't want to say that he was in a trance, though some people would interpret it that way. It's not a trance. John is in spirit. He is somewhere. I don't know if this is out of body or what, but we know John is in the spiritual realm as he's writing this, or that's what he's claiming here in the text. Then a voice like a trumpet. I played the trumpet when I was in school. And there's something about a trumpet that pierces you. When you hear the trumpet, when you hear a bugle call, there's something about it. It permeates through you. And John is trying to describe this voice that he hears as a voice that just permeates him. It's through him. It reverberates in his cells and to his bones. He's trying to describe this. I heard a voice like a trumpet, a ringing penetration. It's unclear if this is Jesus' voice, because in Revelation 1, the first verse of Revelation 1, indicates that the news that John is going to convey to us was given by an angel. I tend to think this is the voice probably of Jesus, as we'll study here in just a second. But if we flip back to Exodus 19 and we think about the trumpet blast, Exodus 19 and various other places in the Old Testament, how the people would hear what sounded like either peals of thunder or loud trumpet blasts from Mount Sinai, or when the law was given, or when the Lord or when God communed with his people. That's the example that's given quite often. It was like loud trumpet blasts. So then we see that the 7 churches are introduced. We kind of set this up already when we're studying the historical context, but the 7 churches, there's no significant order. If you look at a map, and I should have put a map up here from Patmos, you can kind of follow the line around and list the 7 churches of Asia Minor off. Maybe that's what, kind of geographically he was going around that in his head. But there appears to be no significance in the ordering of the churches. But some have tried to link this 7 churches to like the 7 stages of church history. Like the first church was Ephesus, and then the next church age was Samaria. Man, there's just really no biblical evidence for that I could find. I think that's a stretch to connect it to, like, hey, what church age are we in right now? And you'd pick one of these 7, and I guess when you get to the end, that's the end. So at the end, they would say, well, we're in this church age, Laodicea, right now, because we have those same problems that Jesus is going to call that church out for. They try to identify this age with one of the problems that seems to be rampant in one of those churches. I think that's a reach. I think that's not what the text is saying. I don't know where you would get that from. I don't know how you would exegete that text. I don't hold that view, I guess is what I'm saying. The churches have no apparent order, except that maybe the number 7, we talked about this a little bit, is a sign of completeness. So a complete church, the wholeness of the church forever, the church at large. I tend to think it has more to do with that. So I see this idea of completeness, and we'll flush that out as we study some more here. So moving on, starting at verse 12, says this: Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me. And on turning, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, clothed with a long robe and with a golden sash around his waist. The hairs of his beard were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and from his mouth came a sharp, 2-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Wow. So I debated whether I should try to put some images up on the screen. And if you hear the saying that a picture's worth 1,000 words. I disagree with that. I think a word can be so much more captivating when we have to use our imagination. See, if I put a picture up and tell you what I think it looks like, then you're bound by the image that I gave you, and you're restricted by that. But when I read the word to you, when I describe it to you, you're free to let your imagination run wild. And no doubt you're all picturing this in your mind right now. What does this look like? What is going on with John? He turns around and what is he seeing? 7 stars, what? A golden sash, a robe, a white beard like snow. Well, let's talk about the imagery, the beautiful imagery that John is conveying. The 7 lampstands, the 7 golden lampstands. In Exodus 25 and Exodus 37 and Numbers 8, and then I stopped listing the scriptures off because it's in there a lot, indicated that the lampstands were very important parts of the temple. The Hebrew people were told how to specifically construct these lampstands. These lampstands were important. The temple, we think about it like this. The temple, back then in the Old Testament, was the dwelling place of God. So when God said, build me a temple, build me a tabernacle, I will tabernacle amongst you, I will be with you, and this is how you're going to do it. You're going to build these lampstands so big, out of this material, so wide. He's very specific on all the details of building the temple. And we see lampstands hearkening back. So Zechariah, another Old Testament prophet, in chapter 4, Zechariah chapter 4, the Jewish understanding was that the lampstand symbolized Israel, but more specifically, the gathering of all generations at the end of days in Zechariah when he's doing his prophecies. And then we'll get to it, but in Revelation 11, verses 1 through 13, actually confirms that the lampstand, he tells us what the lampstands are, and they're representative of the church as the true temple and the totality of God's people. So here we see John, he sees this vision, and it has lampstands, these 7 lampstands. 7, we've talked about, seems to be a full, indicate fullness or perfection in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament. And these lampstands seem to indicate, these were the furniture that was around the temple where God dwelled. And we see Jesus amongst the lampstands. And further on in Revelation, we see that lampstands are the representation of these churches, these 7 churches that are listed off. And we think about what a lamp does, and we think about the job that it has is to light the way, light the path. So I don't think it's a stretch at all to see these. Okay, if the 7 lamps are the church is, and representative of the fulfillment of God's church, we're to carry a light. We're to be a light. Keep that in the back of your mind. We see the name Son of Man in the midst, in the middle of these lampstands. There was a guy standing there like the Son of Man. The Son of Man is a term Jesus referred to himself. We're studying through Matthew in our sermon series, and we talked about this not too long ago. Son of Man is a reference from Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 10, where he talks about seeing a Son of Man. Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 16, and actually before that, I can't remember what chapter, refers to himself as the Son of Man. He talks about himself as being the Son of Man in reference to the prophetic vision from Daniel. So now we see John, flash forward, sees a vision of the Son of Man standing in the midst of the lampstands. Standing amidst the lampstand, he's the caretaker. Jesus himself is the caretaker of the churches. You have to put oil in it. You have to make sure the lights don't go out. When they do get dim, you have to do something about it. You have to trim the wick and fill the lamp with oil. You have to take care of the lamps. You have to take care of the churches. This is Jesus' church. Hair's white. The hairs of his head were white like wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. We'll get to the fire, but hair's white, eyes like fire. We read Daniel chapter 7, Daniel chapter 10, almost the exact same vision. There stood one with beard like snow, hair was white like snow, and eyes like a torch, like a flame of fire. We see this recurrence back to Daniel again. And he held 7 stars in his right hand. 7 stars in his right hand. And Jesus is actually going to tell us what this stuff means. But the lampstand corresponds to the church, earthly ministry. So the stars would represent the angels of the church, and Jesus will break this down for us here in just a moment. But being in the right hand of somebody means that he's in control. He's the boss. These are his. He controls not only them earthly, but also in the spiritual realm as well. 2-edged sword, sharp. From his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. And his face was like the sun shining in full strength. We turn to Isaiah chapter 11. Let me get there real quick. Isaiah chapter 11. And I should have probably put it up there for time's sake, but I didn't. Isaiah 11, verse 4. Isaiah is also an Old Testament prophet, and he says, "But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equality for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked." And then we could go on to Isaiah 49 in verse 2. "He made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me. He made me a polished arrow. In his quiver he hid me away." We just talked about the words having power. God spoke and created everything. He said, "Let there be light." And we see here a depiction of Jesus. I guess we don't know it's Jesus yet, but we're about to find out. And from his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. Now, when I always picture that, I always picture like a sword swallower, like coming out. But I think the depiction here is it's damaging. It can be damaging. And we know that the word of the Lord is sharp like a 2-edged sword, able to separate the bone from the marrow, two things that are inherently very difficult to separate, but the word of the Lord can separate them. Jesus is the living word. It's no surprise. And starting at verse 17 says this, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet as though dead. But he laid his right hand on me, saying, 'Fear not. I am the first and the last and the living one. I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. And I have the keys of death and Hades. Write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are and those that are to take place after this. As for the mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, well, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So the 7 stars are the spiritual components of a church, that part. The 7 lampstands are the earthly component of the church. And he's in charge of both. And he says, he recommissions John, who's already told us he's commissioned to write what he said, but here we get it straight from the horse's mouth. And who is this? Who is this church? Fear not, I am the first and the last. I am the Alpha, I am the Omega. We've heard this language before. And the living one, I died, and behold, I am alive forevermore. Who is he talking about? It's Jesus. It's absolutely Jesus ascribing godly characters to himself. I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am he. So definitely a reference to the Trinitarian Godhead. Definitely a reference to Jesus as God, but definitely easy to pick out that this is Jesus who John is getting this vision from, or seeing in his in the Spirit. And then Jesus so typically did this. He broke down the allegory that John's seeing. He's like, let me tell you what this is. I'll tell you what the 7 stars are, and I'll tell you what the 7 lampstands are. He tells us this. This is indicative of his teaching style. We've seen this all through Matthew in his earthly ministry. He gives a parable, and then the disciples say, Jesus, what does that mean? And then Jesus so lovingly tells them. He interprets the parable for them. Increasingly, he does that less and less because he doesn't need to. But we see that that's indicative of him. But all this to say that Revelation 1, we've finished the first chapter of Revelation, uses a ton of the same imagery, the same structure that we see in Daniel, especially chapters 7 and 10 and parts of Zechariah. So it's highly symbolic. We've seen these again. Now, understanding Jewish literature and the Jewish teaching, we see this is almost starting to develop a midrash. Midrash is an interactive way that the Hebrew people would teach. They would sit with the rabbi, you would actually sit under a rabbi, and you'd have these interactions back and forth. This is how they taught. It was interactive, it was dialogue. So we almost see a midrash with previously foretold prophecies in Daniel, and then we see Revelation as maybe the fulfillment of what was already foretold. And it's important that we do this. We first seek the Bible, and we seek the Old Testament, and we look for patterns, and we look for